Hello guys, welcome to another video. Now it looks like Path of Exile 2 is about to receive its first big balance patch, as we're going to be getting a patch announcement video for the 0.1.1 update on January 12th at 8:30 PM GMT, and immediately following that there'll be an episode of the Tavern Talk podcast with the devs to discuss all of the upcoming changes in detail. Now I'm not convinced that this patch will contain any additional new content. It might do, I could be wrong there, but I do expect this to be a very big balance patch that's going to address a lot of the immediate issues that have arisen from the first month or so of Path of Exile 2's live servers, and there's a lot to address. So in this video I'm going to give my predictions for Path of Exile 2 patch 0.1.1, 3 buffs and 3 nerfs. Let's begin with the buffs. For what it's worth, I don't expect too many buffs in this patch because I think player power is already too high, but that doesn't mean that some things aren't undertuned. Buff prediction number 1 is armor, and more specifically the Armour Formula used to calculate damage reduction. Now armor is a mechanic that's supposed to be useful to help mitigate the damage of lots of smaller incoming hits. It was never designed as a tool to provide massive damage reduction against very big hits, but regardless of that, armor's usefulness in Path of Exile 2 is questionable because you're never really able to obtain enough of it for it to feel good in the current content you're running. And that's because the current formula that's being used to calculate damage reduction simply isn't providing enough mitigation to keep up with the progressing levels of damage from monsters as you ascend into higher and higher content. As I mentioned before, armor shouldn't be something you rely on to mitigate huge boss slams, but if you've invested into it, it should feel like a useful stat that feels like a worthwhile investment, and that's just not the case right now. I expect an improvement to the armor formula rather than any changes that would result in players obtaining more armor overall. Now something that's interesting about the armor formula is that the current formula in PoE 2 is the same one that has existed in PoE 1 before it was improved in patch 3.16, Scourge League, during that huge overhaul to player defenses. The reason I find this interesting is that during ExileCon 2023, Crip asked Jonathan about flasks in PoE 2, and Jonathan remarks that he wasn't up to date with the PoE 1 flask affix system, a change that had come into the game 2 years prior to that interview. So I think it's quite likely that this armor formula is just a remnant from old PoE 1 that slipped through the cracks and was supposed to be updated to the same formula that PoE 1 has currently, which would be a vast improvement. Now second for the buff predictions is attack speed multipliers, specifically for mace skills. This one is in here for me because I'm not convinced that GGG is going to budge on characters being able to move while using these skills. I think instead they may go another route and reduce the amount of time a character is locked in place while using mace skills, so combat flow is overall improved. Personally, I prefer if they went with a more balanced approach to allow some skills the freedom to be able to move while using them during their wind-up, and keep other more impactful skills that lock you in place. But they may just tweak the attack speed multipliers on mace abilities so that they go off quicker, and see what happens with player feedback thereafter. Regardless, I absolutely expect some word on mace skills in this patch, as general mace melee, without all of the gimmicks and bugs, feels pretty underwhelming, especially after all of the positive things they had to say about it pre-launch. And lastly, for the buffs we have buff prediction number 3, which is towers in endgame mapping. Towers just feel awful to interact with right now. You need to calculate the best approach to getting to a tower without expending any of your good maps in that region so that you can then empower said good maps with precursor tablets. And on top of that, towers themselves have mediocre layouts and are boring to interact with. I think generally there's a lot of things they could do with towers to make them more fun, but the issues are more underlying and will require a lot of work to solve. Expect short-term improvements in patch 0.1.1, with more impactful overhauls coming later into early access. Now we're moving on to the nerf predictions, and for what it's worth, as I mentioned earlier, I think this patch is going to be a lot more nerf-heavy than it is buff-heavy, and we're beginning with nerf prediction number 1, which is Magic Find. Now I think the change to Magic Find is going to be a very simple one. One line in the patch notes. item rarity no longer applies to currency drops. That's it. I think that's the only change they're going to make in regards to rarity. I think looking back at historical interviews with the devs discussing Magic Find, they like the concept of players trading power level for potential loot, and I doubt they're going to completely crush the system and remove it from the game. The real issue for Magic Find in comparison to PoE 1 is that rarity currently affects currency drops, and that massively affects the trade economy, and not in a good way. It feels bad to farm on a character with low or no item rarity, knowing that you could be missing out on currency drops upgrading to much rarer orbs. So I expect GGG to make currency drops static regardless of how much increased item rarity you have. And up next for the nerfs is prediction number 2, which is Grim Feast. So Grim Feast is a reservation skill that not only helps you to solve energy shield recovery while mapping, but also props up your defenses by providing up to double your energy shield as overflowed ES. I get the impression that this skill was intended as more of a way to solve recovery for energy shield rather than this extreme layer of EHP, especially considering how much worse energy shield recharges baseline compared to PoE 1, and how much you need to invest into that mechanic to make it feel good for general gameplay. Now there's a couple of ways they could go about nerfing this one, but knowing how they usually go about nerfing the really out of control mechanics, I think this one is going to get completely destroyed. It may even get the classic GGG triple tap. I expect a higher reservation cost for Spirit baseline, and I also think they'll lower the amount of overflowed ES you can reach to maybe 25 or 30% of your maximum ES on a level 20 gem. Additionally, they may even nerf the amount of ES recovered per remnant picked up, and overall, this skill is going to look very different come patch day. Lastly, for the nerfs, it is of course Archmage. This one is pretty self-explanatory, and I'm sure it's at the top of most people's expected nerf lists. Archmage is extremely overtuned, to the point where you actually just use this ability in builds that don't even invest a huge amount into mana, because it provides far too much damage scaling per 100 maximum mana. Now, GGG want this skill to be good for builds investing heavily into mana, and not just a shoo-in for a lot of caster builds. So expect Archmage to gain a lot less extra damage at lower mana investment, and potentially also have a higher mana cost for spells, so it's harder to utilise for builds with weaker mana sustain. And there you have it, my predictions for 3 buffs and 3 nerfs for patch 0.1.1 for Path of Exile 2. What are your predictions for the upcoming patch? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.